Gladiator. The very word conjures up a picture of a sun-drenched arena, the roar of a crowd of thousands, the glint of a sword and blood on the sand. We see a man-machine made to kill, a slave whose life is not worth a copper coin and whose fate is decided by the gesture of the emperor. This picture, replicated by Hollywood and popular culture, is simple, brutal, and clear. But it is only a small part of the truth. Behind the glitter of the armor was a complex and contradictory reality. The gladiator was both a despised outcast, disenfranchised, and an adored superstar whose portraits were painted on the walls of houses. He was a slave, but he was also a costly investment, with fortunes invested in his training and diet. His fights were not chaotic carnage, but a deadly sport with strict rules, referees, and even draws. And his death was not the end, but the beginning of a grim and elaborate ritual. It is in these contradictions that the real story of the gladiators lies. A story that reflects not just the brutality, but the complexity of the Roman world. Its obsession with death and discipline, its legal system, its social hierarchy, and even its notions of love and companionship. And here's a question. Would you be able to look behind the scenes at the Colosseum and see not just a massacre, but a complex system in which money, fame, desperation, and a strange form of honor were intertwined? Could you understand why free citizens would willingly sell themselves into slavery for a chance to enter the arena? And the central question of our investigation, what happened when the blood-soaked sand of the arena cooled? Where were the bodies of the fallen taken? And who were these men really like outside of their deadly craft? Stay until the end, and you'll learn the whole truth about gladiatorial combat. This is not just an account of violence, it's a story of life, death, and what followed in the heart of the ruthless Roman Empire. The first and foremost myth that needs to be busted is the notion that all gladiators were unfortunate slaves or criminals sentenced to death who were forced into the arena. The reality was far more complex and diverse. The composition of the gladiatorial family was variegated, and the motives that brought people into the arena varied greatly, reflecting the complexity of Roman society, where glory and disgrace were two sides of the same coin. Of course, a significant proportion of gladiators were slaves and prisoners of war. Men captured on the battlefields of Germany, Dacia, or Britain with strength and fighting skills were ideal material for gladiatorial schools. Their lives were worthless, and their death in the arena was a continuation of war by other means, a demonstration of Rome's power. Convicted criminals, noxi, were also sent to the arena, but it is important to distinguish here. Those sentenced ad gladium, to the sword, were actually death row prisoners who were released into the arena for a show of execution. Those sentenced ad ludum, to the gladiatorial school, on the other hand, were given a chance. Several years of hard labor training and fighting awaited them, but if they survived, after 3 to 5 years, they could receive freedom and a wooden sword, rudis, as a symbol of liberation. Most surprising and unexpected, however, was the existence of the volunteers, auctorati. These were free citizens of Rome who, for various reasons, voluntarily signed a contract with the owner of the gladiatorial school, Lanista. They took an oath, Sacramentum Gladiatorium, by which they agreed to be beaten, burned, and killed by the sword, effectively giving up their freedom for the duration of the contract. Why did they do this? The reasons varied. Some because of huge debts, and the performance fee could save them from ruin. Some were former soldiers who could not find themselves in a peaceful life and long for battle and glory. And some are young people who crave adrenaline, fame, and adoration of the crowd, like modern extreme sports stars. By becoming a gladiator, a man automatically received the status of infamisum, dishonored, but in return he could gain fame, which an ordinary plebeian could not dream of. Even women, though rarely, entered the arena as gladiatrixes. Roman society treated it with contempt, but the sight of a woman in armor attracted the public. Emperor Septimius Severus eventually banned women's fights as undermining morals. Thus, the gladiatorial corps was a complex social cross-section. It included desperate slaves, proud warriors, adventurers, and bankrupts. Each came to the arena with his own story and his own hope, for death, for freedom, or for glory. The gladiator was not just a fighter, he was a complex social phenomenon, reflecting all the ills, passions, and paradoxes of the Roman world. The place where yesterday's slave, barbarian, or freedman was transformed into a lethal machine for the entertainment of the crowd was called Ludus, gladiatorial school. But it was not just an educational institution, but a hybrid of a maximum security prison, an elite sports boarding school, and a military camp. Life here was subject to iron discipline, and training was on the edge of human capabilities, forming not only the body, but also a special type of psyche. Once in the Ludus, a newcomer was stripped of his name and his past. He became a part of Familia Gladiatoria, gladiatorial family, where Lanista, the owner of the school, was his father, master, and jailer. The day began before dawn and was timed to the minute. The training was grueling. The novices spent hours practicing strokes on a wooden pole, palus, with a heavy wooden sword that was twice as heavy as a real battle sword. They learned fencing under the guidance of experienced trainers, doctors, often former gladiators who had retired. Each gladiator specialized in a particular type of weapon, and training was done with blunt weapons, but injuries, fractures, dislocations, lacerations were common. Discipline was brutal. For disobedience, laziness, or cowardice of the gladiator awaited severe punishments. Flogging, imprisonment in shackles, the punishment cell. Lutus was surrounded by high walls and guarded. Escape was almost impossible. But the Ludus was not only a place of suffering. In this closed, isolated environment, where every day could be the last, a unique phenomenon was born: the gladiatorial brotherhood. These people, doomed to kill each other in the arena, became comrades within the walls of the school. They lived together in cramped cells, ate from the same pot, trained side by side, shared pain, fear, and hope. Strong friendships were formed. Experienced gladiators, veterani, took under their tutelage newcomers, tirones, passing on to them their experience of survival. Sometimes these friendships grew into something more. Ludus was an exclusively male world where normal social and family ties were severed. In this atmosphere of constant stress, testosterone, and near-death experiences, deep emotional and, at times, physical attachments were formed between the fighters. They became each other's sole support. On some tombstones of gladiators can be found epitaphs full of sorrow and tenderness, dedicated to a fallen comrade in arms, where one gladiator calls the other his soul, or dear comrade in arms. These inscriptions are rare but poignant testimonies that even in this cruel world, there was room for human affection beyond simple friendship. This aspect is often overlooked, but it is critical to understanding the psychology of the gladiator. The man who might kill you in the arena tomorrow might be the closest thing in the world to you today. Modern culture paints us gladiators as athletes with textured, lean muscles, similar to modern bodybuilders. However, scientific evidence from the study of remains from the gladiatorial cemetery at Ephesus tells a very different story. Their diet was designed not for aesthetics, but to maximize endurance and survivability in battle. It was a highly technical, for its time, nutritional system aimed at a specific result. Ancient authors, such as Pliny the Elder, referred to gladiators as hordeari, barley men, and it wasn't an insult. Barley was the basis of their diet. Unlike legionaries, for whom barley was a punishment, for gladiators it was the primary fuel. Why? Barley was a source of complex carbohydrates, which provided the slow but very long-lasting energy needed for a long, exhausting fight. The diet was predominantly vegetarian, high in carbohydrates and legumes. Gladiators ate a lot of barley porridge, beans, and lentils. This diet led to the formation of not only muscle mass, but also a noticeable layer of subcutaneous fat. This fat served several crucial functions. First, it served as an additional source of energy. Secondly, and most importantly, it was a kind of natural armor. The layer of fat protected vital organs, nerve endings, and large blood vessels from shallow cuts. A superficial wound that would be dangerous on a dry body looked spectacular on a gladiator's body, bleeding for the crowd's amusement, but not causing critical damage. This allowed them to withstand more blows and continue the fight. To compensate for the lack of calcium in such a plant-based diet, gladiators drank a special drink, a solution of wood or bone ash. The ash is rich in calcium and strontium, which, as skeletal studies have shown, helped strengthen the bones and heal them quickly after the many fractures that were an integral part of training. It was a primitive but effective analog to modern mineral supplements, demonstrating a deep practical understanding of the body's needs. Meat was rare in their diet, more of a reward than an everyday food. Lanista, the owner of the school, wasn't interested in his fighters being beautiful. He was interested in them being tough, strong, and able to withstand as much damage as possible. His gladiator was not to be a sprinter, but an arena marathoner capable of enduring a long and bloody fight. This diet, rich in carbohydrates and calcium, combined with grueling workouts, created a special type of physique. Massive, strong fighters with thick bones and a protective layer of fat. They weren't like statues of Greek gods. They were like bears, powerful, tough, and incredibly dangerous. Gladiatorial fights were not a chaotic dump, but a carefully directed and thought-out spectacle, a kind of death theater. Each gladiator played a different role, determined by his weaponry, armor, and battle tactics. There were many types of gladiators, and their duels were not random, but carefully matched pairs, where the strengths of one type countered the strengths of the other, creating a tense and unpredictable duel. One of the most recognizable and unusual was the Retiarius. He was armed like a fisherman, a trident, a dagger, and a net. Of his armor, he had only a shoulder plate, Galerius, and a wristband, Manica. He was lightly armed, fast, and agile. His tactic was to keep his distance, wear down his opponent, and try to throw a net over him before striking him with his trident. His classic opponent was the Secutor, or Stalker. He was heavily armed, a large rectangular shield, Scutum, a short sword, Gladius, and most importantly, a sleek, streamlined helmet with no brim and small eye sockets. This helmet protected him from the trident, but severely restricted his vision and breathing. The Secutor's job was to close in on the Retiarius as quickly as possible and impose close combat on him before he suffocated in his own helmet. It was a duel of speed versus power, agility versus armor. Another popular pairing was the Murmillo, and the Thracian Thraex. Murmillo, so named because of his helmet decorated with a crest in the shape of a fish, was armed with a large shield, and Gladius like a legionary. The Thracian, on the other hand, who came from Thrace, was protected by a small square shield and armed with a short curved sword, the Sika, capable of delivering insidious blows from behind the opponent's shield. There were other types, the Hoplomachus, armed like a Greek hoplite, the Retiarius, who fought in a chariot, and the Dimasher, armed with two swords. Each type required unique physical training and tactics. The Lanistas and the organizers of the games, editors, were true masters of casting, selecting pairs so that the fight was as spectacular as possible and kept the crowd in suspense. Sometimes exotic fighters, such as the Andabat, who fought blind, wearing a helmet with no eye holes for the amusement of the audience, were allowed into the arena. This system of roles turned the fight into a complex game of chess, where each move could be the last. The spectators understood the subtleties of weapons and tactics as well as modern soccer fans, supporting their favorites and assessing the skill of each fighter. Contrary to popular myth, gladiatorial combat was not a savage slaughter to the last breath. It was a strictly regulated fight with its own rules, judges, and even the possibility of a draw. The main reason for this was not humanism, but economics. A well-trained gladiator was an incredibly expensive asset, and losing him in every fight was simply unprofitable for the Lanista. The fight was monitored by the judges. The chief judge was called Summa Rudis, and his assistant was called Secunda Rudis. They could be recognized by their long staffs or sticks, which they used to separate fighters if they violated the rules. For example, if they fought passively or got into a clinch. The referee could stop the fight to give the fighters a break, or if one of them was injured but could continue. Death in the arena certainly happened, but it was not a mandatory outcome. According to statistics based on analysis of tombstones and historical records, the probability of dying in battle for a gladiator in the 1st century AD was about 1 in 10. That is, on average, 1 in 10 fights ended in death. These were high, but not 100% odds. A fight could end in more than one outcome. A clear victory was when one of the gladiators was killed or mortally wounded. but often the losing fighter, being wounded or exhausted, could admit defeat. To do this, he would drop his weapon and raise up the index finger of his left hand. At that moment, his fate passed into the hands of the editor, the organizer of the games, who made the final decision. Sometimes, if both gladiators fought with exceptional courage and skill, and both remained on their feet, the judge could declare a draw. Stands misses, released standing. Both fighters left the arena alive and honored, which was a great achievement. The main purpose of the fight was not to kill as such, but to demonstrate valor, virtues, skill, and the ability to face death. A gladiator who fought bravely but lost had a much better chance of mercy than one who showed cowardice. Romans came to the arena not just for blood, but for the spectacle of overcoming fear. That's why experienced veterans, who were loved by the public, were valued for their weight in gold, and they tried to keep them as long as possible. The famous thumbs-down gesture, pollice verso, signifying the death sentence, is perhaps the most famous, but at the same time the most controversial image associated with gladiatorial fights. Thanks to pictures and movies, we are certain that this is how the crowd demanded death. However, the historical evidence is much more vague, and it was probably not quite like that. When a defeated gladiator raised a finger, admitting defeat, all eyes turned to the editor of the games, the emperor or magistrate who paid for the spectacle. He had to make a decision, to grant life, missio, or to order to finish, jugula. And he made this decision based on the reaction of the crowd. The crowd shouted, whistled, waved their handkerchiefs, expressing their opinion. It was a moment of direct dialogue between the ruler and the people. As for the gesture itself, there is no consensus among historians. The Latin expression pollice verso can be translated as turned finger, but in what direction? There are several versions. One of the most popular says that a clenched fist with a thumb hidden inside symbolized a sword in a scabbard and meant mercy. But the thumb pointing upwards, as if imitating the movement of a sword thrust into the throat, was a sign of death. That is, everything could be exactly the opposite of what we are used to seeing. Another version states that the sign of death was any finger pointed, upward or sideways, and the sign of life was when the audience waved white handkerchiefs, mappa. Regardless of the specific gesture, the editor's decision was a political one. To refuse the bloodthirsty crowd meant risking his popularity, but it was also unprofitable to kill a public favorite who fought bravely. Therefore, the editor weighed the pros and cons, the valor of the loser, the cost of the gladiator, the mood of the crowd. If a death sentence was passed, the winner had to carry it out. This was one of the darkest moments of the ritual. The loser had to stoically accept death, sometimes even kneeling and putting his throat under the sword of the winner. Showing fear at this moment was considered a disgrace. The winner, having carried out the sentence, received a palm branch and a monetary reward. If the loser was granted life, he left the arena alive to heal, train, and prepare for the next fight. The social status of the gladiator in Roman society is one of the most striking paradoxes. On the one hand, by law, he was infamous, disgraced, a man of inferiority, on a par with actors, prostitutes, and procurers. He was deprived of most civil rights, unable to hold public office or testify in court. He was a social outcast. But on the other hand, successful gladiators were real superstars, whose popularity was comparable to the fame of modern rock musicians or soccer players. Everyone knew their names. Children played gladiators using wooden swords. Images of famous fighters could be seen on mosaics, lamps, dishes. On the walls of Pompeii, there are numerous graffiti praising this or that gladiator. Ludus Thracianus, the sigh and joy of all girls. Crescentus Retiarius, the lord of the nets. Gladiators were real sex symbols. Their brutality, courage, proximity to death, and physical power had a hypnotic effect on Roman women, especially those from high society. To have an affair with a gladiator was a risky but incredibly exciting adventure for a noblewoman. The historian Juvenal sarcastically describes how the wife of Senator Eppius fled to Egypt with a gladiator named Sergius, trading her family and reputation for a love of scars, sweat, and steel. The sweat of gladiators was considered an aphrodisiac. It was scraped off the fighters' bodies with a special scraper, strigil, and sold in small vials to noble ladies who added it to their cosmetics. This duality, contempt in law and adoration in practice, created a unique social niche. The gladiator was both at the bottom of society and at the pinnacle of fame. He was an object of desire, and at the same time a man with whom one could not even sit at the same table in a decent home. This mixture of fear, contempt, and lust made the image of the gladiator so attractive and dangerous. Within their familia gladiatoria, they also built complex relationships. The surviving veterans, covered in scars, were held in great respect. They were mentors to the younger ones. Sometimes gladiators formed a kind of labor unions or funeral collegia to provide a decent burial for their fallen comrades. This internal solidarity was a way of facing the outside world, which both idolized and despised them. When a duel ended in death, a grim but strictly regulated ritual would begin to confirm the death and clear the arena for the next fight. This was the final act of the drama, and it too was part of the spectacle. First, it was necessary to make sure that the defeated gladiator was really dead and not faking it to avoid the fatal blow. For this purpose, a special attendant in costume would enter the arena. Most often, it was a man in the mask of Charon, in Etruscan mythology, Haru, a demon of the afterlife. He was dressed in gloomy clothes and carried a huge hammer in his hands. With this hammer, he struck the head of a fallen gladiator. Another servant, in the costume of the god Mercury, Psychopomp, the guide of souls, touched the body with a red-hot rod. The lack of reaction to these checks was the final confirmation of death. After that, the body was removed from the arena. This was done by attendants called Libitinari, from the name of Libitina, the goddess of funerals. They used special hooks to hook the body by the legs and drag it out of the arena through a special gate called the Porta Libitinaria, the Gate of Death. This crude and humiliating way of carrying the body away emphasized the low status of the fallen and the fact that his life was over. The arena at this time was sprinkled with fresh sand to soak up the blood and prepare for the next pair of fighters. This ritual was important for several reasons. First, it had the practical significance of removing the body and confirming death. Second, it carried deep symbolic and religious meaning. The appearance of figures from the afterlife blurred the line between representation and reality, reminding the audience of the inevitability of death and the power of the gods of the underworld. Third, it was part of the show. The brutality and grim solemnity of this moment was meant to impress the crowd, preparing them for a new surge of emotion. The body dragged through the gate of death went to the spoliarium, a special room under the stands or near the amphitheater. Here the dead man was stripped of his armor and weapons, which were the property of the lanista and were very expensive. This was the last point in his gladiatorial career. He was stripped of everything that defined him in the arena and again became just a dead body. His future fate depended on many factors. The fate of a gladiator's body after he was stripped of his armor in the spoliarium varied and depended on his status, the presence of his comrades, and the will of his lanista. For most nameless slaves and criminals, the journey was short and inglorious. The bodies of many gladiators, especially those who had no friends or money, were simply thrown into communal pits or into the Tiber River. They did not deserve a separate grave or funeral rites. Their deaths were as utilitarian an event as their lives. They were expendable, and after use, they were disposed of in the cheapest way possible. However, things were different for successful and famous gladiators and those who had loyal comrades. Gladiators often organized funeral collegia. These were a kind of mutual aid societies whose members made regular contributions to a common treasury. When one of the members of the collegia died, this money was used to organize a decent funeral and put a tombstone. This was extremely important for a Roman, as it was believed that the soul of a person left unburied would not find peace. Archaeologists find entire gladiatorial cemeteries, for example in Ephesus or York. Analyzing these burials provides invaluable information. We can see that many were buried with care. The headstones often indicated the name or alias of the gladiator, his type, Retiarius, Secutor, number of fights fought, victories, and age. Sometimes epitaphs were very touching. They could be put by a wife, children, yes, some gladiators had families, or comrades in arms. One tombstone placed by his wife reads, Flam Secutor, who lived 30 years, fought 34 times, won 21 times, fought to a draw 9 times, pardoned 4 times. Delia put this tombstone to a deserving husband. Such inscriptions are voices from the past, telling the stories of specific people, their achievements and losses. Sometimes epitaphs also contain the bitterness of camaraderie. One gladiator might place a monument to his friend with whom they trained together, but who had to face each other in mortal combat. These monuments are evidence of the most complex human relationships in a world where friendship and deadly rivalry were inseparable. Thus, a dead gladiator could go either to an unmarked pit or to his own grave with an honorable epitaph that immortalized his name and fame. His final resting place was not the arena, but the memory of those who loved or respected him. The question of what happened to the gladiator's soul after death did not have an unambiguous answer in the Roman worldview. Roman religion did not offer a single, coherent doctrine of heaven and hell, like Christianity. The fate of the soul in the afterlife was vague and depended on a variety of factors, including the circumstances of death and the correctness of funeral rites. According to common beliefs, after death, the soul, or shadow, umbra, went to the underworld ruled by Pluto and Proserpina. It was a gloomy, gray world where the shadows of the deceased led a joyless, semi-conscious existence. Heroes and great men could get to Elysium, a kind of paradise fields, but an ordinary gladiator, and even with the shameful status of infames, could not count on such a fate. The circumstances of death played a special role. It was believed that the souls of those who died a violent or premature death became restless spirits that could get stuck between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Such spirits, called lemures, or larvae, could return and harm the living. The soul of a gladiator who died in the arena in the prime of life, full of rage and pain, was an ideal candidate for such ghosts. Perhaps it was this fear of restless souls that some of the rituals in the arena were associated with. The appearance of Charon and Mercury, the guides of souls, was meant to symbolically escort the soul to the underworld, preventing it from remaining among the living. A proper burial, which fellow collegians endeavored to ensure, was also necessary to soothe the soul and help it find peace. There was also another darker belief. The blood and flesh of gladiators were thought to carry tremendous vitality and fury. Some magicians and sorcerers might seek to obtain them for their rituals. The blood of a newly killed gladiator was considered a cure for epilepsy. Thus, the afterlife of the gladiator in the eyes of the Romans was unenviable. At best, his shadow awaited a dreary existence in the realm of the dead. At worst, he could become an evil ghost, doomed to wander the earth forever. He had no chance of heroic apotheosis as a citizen warrior fallen in battle. His valor was a spectacle for the crowd, but it did not give him a ticket to a better world. His glory was bright but short, and it ended with his last breath on the sand of the arena, after which either eternal darkness or a restless twilight awaited him.